The train whistle shrieked across the valley, steam curling into the bright morning as the brides filed down one by one, ribbons fluttering, satin hems sweeping across the wooden platform, while the crowd pressed close to watch which rancher would claim which girl, laughter and gossip rising like flies over sugar. At the far end of the line stood the girl no one wanted, her dress plain as muslin and her posture bowed from weeks of being mocked. And when a sharp wind caught her veil, some boy from the crowd darted forward and tugged it loose with a jeer, yanking the thin fabric from her head and waving it high while the onlookers roared with laughter. She snatched at it, cheeks burning, but stumbled, and the veil fluttered to the boards, trampled beneath boots as the others tittered. There she is, the unwanted one, the shame of the line. She stood trembling, her hands knotted before her, eyes downcast as the brides beside her pulled their skirts closer, eager not to be touched by her disgrace, and for a moment it seemed she would shrink smaller and smaller until she disappeared. But then the crowd's noise shifted, not to laughter, but to a low murmur that rippled like wind through grass, and heads turned toward the figure moving along the line. The Lakota warrior had come to Dustin with quiet steps and a bearing that silenced rooms, tall and broad-shouldered, his braids tied neat against the leather vest he wore, his eyes dark and unreadable as he walked slowly past the brides who fluttered lashes and smiled, each one waiting for his gaze to rest on her. He did not pause. One by one he passed them without word or glance, until he reached the girl with the torn veil still lying in the dirt, her hands trembling as she bent to retrieve it. The crowd hushed, expectation hanging sharp in the air. And then a gasp broke from a dozen throats as the warrior stopped before her, his shadow falling long across the boards. She looked up at him, startled, her lips parting though no sound came, and he bent to lift the veil from the ground, shaking the dust from it with slow care before placing it gently back in her hands. Gasps turned to shocked whispers, a woman in the crowd muttering, "Why her?" While a man barked, "He passed them all for the unwanted one." The warrior's gaze did not shift from hers as he straightened, and in that stillness she felt something fierce and steady settle in her chest, as though his presence itself shielded her from the storm of ridicule. He extended his hand, wordless, a gesture that carried more weight than any speech, and though her heart pounded with disbelief, she placed her fingers in his, the veil clutched tight in her other hand. Murmurs swelled into outrage, women scoffing, men sneering, and somewhere a rival's voice rang out sharp, "He mocks us all, choosing shame over beauty." But the Lakota warrior did not answer them, only turned with her hand in his, and began to walk, leading her from the line while the crowd parted in stunned silence. At the edge of the platform, the whispers followed like snapping dogs, and the girl clutched the veil to her chest, knowing it was no longer just a scrap of fabric but the mark of everything she had been denied. As the warrior's stride carried them away, the last sound she heard was the sharp hiss of a woman's voice. Unwanted she may be, but now she is his. The platform buzzed like a hive struck with a stick, whispers turning to jeers as the Lakota warrior led her down the steps, her hand trembling in his, but held firm as though his strength poured into her bones. Behind them the line of brides broke into chatter, some with pinched faces of outrage, others with wide eyes of disbelief, their ribbons and lace forgotten in the weight of what had just happened. He walked past all of them, someone muttered bitterly, and chose the shame. Another voice rose, sharp with envy. Does he think himself above us? To spit on the finest and claim the scraps? Men who had eyed him with wary respect now let their pride sour into anger, and a rancher barked, "You dishonor our women, warrior. Dustin won't forget it." Still he did not answer, his steps measured, his hand steady on hers, as if their words slid from him like rain on stone. She kept her eyes low, the veil pressed to her chest, shame and wonder battling within her, until her lips parted, and she whispered, barely audible, "Why me?" He glanced down at her, his expression calm, unreadable, yet his voice when it came was deep and certain. "Because they did not see you." "I did." The words struck her heart like a spark to dry grass, igniting warmth even as the crowd's ridicule grew sharper. A boy from the mercantile hurled the insult, "Unwanted bride, he can have her," and laughter chased it like wildfire, cruel and shrill. She flinched, but the warrior stopped, turning slow to face them, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until silence rippled outward, the laughter dying on their lips. He said nothing, only let his presence weigh heavy, his hand tightening on hers as if to remind her she was not alone. Then he turned back, guiding her forward again, each step a defiance of the voices snapping at their heels. At the end of the street they reached the horse tethered to the post, the roan tossing its head as if it too felt the tension in the air. The warrior lifted her with ease, settling her onto the saddle before mounting behind her, his arm a protective band across her waist. Gasps rose again, scandal layered with fascination, as the sight of her seated before him burned into their memory. "He'll regret it," a woman hissed. "Beauty wasted on shame." "No," another muttered, softer, almost awed. "She doesn't look unwanted now." The horse moved, hooves striking sparks against the frozen boards, and the town faded behind them, though the weight of its eyes seemed to follow still. She held the veil tight, her pulse racing, her mind a storm of fear and disbelief. But beneath it all was a flicker of something she had not felt in years. Hope. The warrior rode silent, his chest solid against her back, his breath steady, as if nothing in the world could touch them while he held the reins. Yet she knew the crowd's fury was not finished, that humiliation once stirred would not rest until it struck again. As the wind whipped past and the prairie stretched wide, she whispered into the cold air, "They will come for us." He answered without hesitation, his voice quiet but iron. "Let them. You are not unwanted. Not while I breathe." And in that vow she felt the first threads of courage twine with her fear, though in the distance the town's whispers lingered like thunder before the storm. By the time the warrior's roan reached the cabin at the edge of the cottonwoods, her hands ached from clutching the torn veil so tightly, as though it alone held her together. He dismounted with easy grace, then lifted her down, his strength steady where her knees shook. The cabin stood plain but solid, smoke curling from the chimney, a life carved from silence rather than splendor, and she felt a pang of fear. Was this to be her home? The place where whispers from town would never cease to follow? Inside, the fire snapped bright, and he set water to warm without a word, moving with quiet rhythm, as though this act of sheltering her required no ceremony. She sat at the small table, the veil spread across her lap, its edge frayed and stained from being trampled, and the sight of it sent fresh tears blurring her vision. "Do you know why they call me unwanted?" she asked at last, her voice breaking. He turned, his gaze fixed on her, though he said nothing, waiting. She swallowed hard. "Because I was promised once, a man from Dustin. But when his eye wandered to another, he said I was too plain, too small, too weak to keep. He cast me aside, and the town laughed. Ever since, I've been the girl no one chose." Her fingers twisted in the fabric, the shame rising fresh with the telling. "That veil was meant to hide me, to make me less of a spectacle. But today they ripped it off, and I thought I would die from their laughter." The warrior crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers. His voice was low, steady, carrying weight that settled her trembling heart. A veil cannot hide dignity. They mocked because they are blind, not because you are plain. He touched the fabric lightly, his calloused hand brushing the frayed edge. This is not shame. It is proof you endured. She blinked, startled, the words foreign after years of mockery. Proof? He nodded once. You stood. You still stand. For the first time, she looked at the veil differently, not as the symbol of rejection, but as something that had weathered cruelty with her. The fire cracked louder, shadows dancing on the walls, and for a heartbeat, she felt almost safe. But the moment shattered when hooves thundered past outside, voices carrying through the dark. She froze, clutching the veil tighter, while the warrior's jaw hardened. He stepped to the door, peering into the night, then shut it with a firmness that rattled the frame. They watch, he said, his voice clipped. Hale's men. They will test you again. Fear flooded her, the echo of laughter at the station still raw, and she whispered, I cannot bear to have it torn again. He turned to her, his expression fierce yet calm. Then they will find my hand between theirs and you. She trembled, her heart racing, but when she looked at him she saw no doubt, only the iron certainty of a man who had chosen and would not bend. She touched the veil again, softer this time, and though her hands still shook, a spark flickered within. Perhaps, she thought, the veil would not always mark her shame. Perhaps, in his hands, it might yet become her crown. And though the hoofbeats faded into the distance, she knew the next tear would come not from cloth, but from the fabric of her courage. And when it did, the warrior's vow would be tested before all. 2 days later, the town square swelled with voices. Wagons lined tight along the road as folks gathered for market. But the talk was not of trade. Every eye turned when the Lakota warrior rode in with her seated before him, the torn veil folded neatly in her lap. Whispers buzzed like hornets, women clutching shawls tighter, men sneering as though his choice had shamed them personally. There she is, the unwanted, someone muttered, and look at him, parading her like a prize. She felt the heat of their stares burning through her, her fingers gripping the veil until her knuckles whitened, but the warrior dismounted calm and sure, lifting her down with a steadiness that made the crowd falter. He placed her hand on his arm and walked toward the stalls, his stride unhurried, daring any man to stand in his path. A group of ranchers near the well leaned close, their laughter carrying sharp. He passed 20 beauties for a cast-off, one spat. Lakota pride or Lakota folly? Another smirked. Maybe he took her because no white man would. The words cut deep, shame pressing like a weight on her chest, but before her head could bow, the warrior stopped, turning his gaze on them. Silence fell as he stood there, eyes hard as stone, until one by one they looked away, their bravado crumbling under the force of his calm defiance. He said nothing, yet the quiet he left behind spoke louder than their insults. She drew a breath, her heart steadying, but the reprieve was short. Vernon Hale stepped from the mercantile, broad hat tipped low, his smile sharp as a knife. Well now, he drawled, the unwanted bride walks proud at last, but pride borrowed from another man's shadow won't keep long. The crowd tittered, eager for spectacle. She stiffened, clutching the veil to her chest, but the warrior only placed a hand over hers, his voice steady and deep. Her shadow is her own. Mine only shields it. Hale's eyes narrowed, his pride pricked. He took a step closer, his voice loud enough for all to hear. What kind of man parades shame as honor? You shame this town, warrior. You shame us all. Murmurs of agreement rippled, though softer, uncertain. The warrior's gaze did not waver. I passed the brides because I did not seek vanity. I sought truth, and I found it in the one you cast aside. His words hung heavy, silencing even those eager to mock, but Hale's sneer only deepened. Then we'll see if truth keeps you when the veil falls again. The threat slithered into her bones, fear tightening her throat. And she knew the veil was not finished with her. She felt its weight like a chain, fragile and frayed, but somehow more precious because he had lifted it from the dirt and placed it back in her hands. As they left the square, the crowd's whispers followed, sharp as spurs, and though the warrior's stride remained unbroken, she felt the storm gathering. The veil would be torn again. Hale had promised it. And when it happened, she wondered if she would have the strength to stand. Or if this man who had chosen her against the world could hold the weight of her shame a second time. The storm broke sooner than she feared. That Sunday, the townsfolk gathered outside the church, bonnets and hats bobbing as hymns spilled faintly from within, but most eyes were not on Scripture. They were on her. She stood at the edge of the crowd, beside the Lakota warrior, the torn veil pinned carefully back into her hair, her fingers tight around its edge, though her hands trembled. Vernon Hale strode forward, boots crunching on the gravel, his voice carrying loud enough for all to hear. "Look at her," he said, sweeping his arm as though presenting a spectacle. "Dustin's unwanted bride, hiding behind cloth that can't change what she is." Laughter broke, cruel and eager, and before she could step back, he lunged, snatching the veil from her head in one violent tug. Gasps erupted, women covering their mouths, men craning to see her shame laid bare. She froze, the winter air burning her scalp, tears rising unbidden as the veil dangled from Hale's fist, his grin sharp as a blade. "See?" he crowed. "Nothing here worth the warrior's pride, plain as mud, weak as water. He mocks us all by claiming her." The crowd roared with laughter, some clapping, others jeering, and her knees buckled beneath the weight of it, the memory of every whispered insult rushing back like a flood. But before she could fall, the warrior moved. His hand caught her arm, steadying her. Then he stepped forward, his shadow cutting across Hale like a drawn blade. His voice rang deep and fierce, echoing against the clapboard walls. "You shame yourselves, not her." The laughter faltered, unease prickling the air, but Hale sneered, shaking the veil high. A man who chooses the unwanted cannot speak of shame. The warrior's gaze burned, and in one swift motion he struck, knocking the veil from Hale's hand to the dirt. Gasps rippled, the crowd stumbling back as silence fell. He bent, lifted the veil, and placed it back into her trembling hands, his touch firm, his eyes on hers. "You are not unwanted," he said, voice low but carrying. "You are mine because you are worthy." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some scoffing, others awed. Hale's face darkened, his pride cut raw. "You'll regret this, warrior," he spat. "She will drag you down." The warrior stepped closer, his voice quiet but heavy as thunder. "Better to be dragged down by truth than lifted by lies." Hale recoiled, fury twisting his face, but the crowd's silence left him no victory. He turned on his heel, storming away with his men trailing, but his threat hung sharp in the air. She clutched the veil to her chest, her tears spilling, not from shame now, but from the weight of being defended so boldly. For the first time, she felt the fabric not as a curse, but as something sanctified, touched by his hands, guarded by his vow. The crowd began to murmur again, divided, some shaking heads, others whispering that perhaps the warrior saw something they had not. As the hymn inside the church reached its final verse, she realized her life had split in two. The years she had lived bowed under laughter, and the years that would follow, walking beside a man who refused to bow to anyone. Yet beneath the fragile hope, fear still coiled. Hale's pride had been wounded before all of Dustin, and men like him did not bleed without hungering for revenge. The week that followed the churchyard humiliation turned the town into a cauldron, its voices divided sharp down the middle. At the mercantile, some women muttered that the Lakota warrior had ruined Dustin's order by choosing the one no man wanted, that it was indecent for her to walk proud with her veil stitched and worn like a banner. Yet others whispered quieter, almost in secret, that perhaps there was strength in her they had never noticed, that the way he placed the veil back into her hands had been a kind of crowning no minister could match. Children stared openly when she passed, some with curiosity, some repeating their parents' sneers, but she kept her head high, though her fingers never left the fabric clutched against her chest. Elias Redfeather, though the town rarely spoke his name aloud, moved through the streets as if none of it touched him, his stride steady, his gaze meeting all who dared look. He bought supplies, spoke only what was needed, and returned to the cabin with her at his side. But beneath his calm, she felt the tension in his silence, the coil of a man bracing for what must come. One evening as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, painting the snow in hues of blood and fire, she laid the veil across the table and whispered, "You can't fight a whole town." He set the kindling firm in the hearth, then straightened, his eyes steady on hers. "I won't fight a town. I'll fight the man who stirs it." She shivered, knowing he meant Hale, knowing too that pride cut deep wounds men bled for. "What if he tears it again?" she asked, her voice breaking as she touched the frayed edge. "What if I break?" Elias stepped close, his shadow falling over her, his hand lifting hers gently until the veil lay between their palms. "Cloth tears. You don't." His words were quiet, but they steadied her more than any shout could. Still, whispers found their way to her ears. At the well, a matron scoffed, "He'll tire of carrying pity." At the smithy, a boy laughed, "Veil or no, she'll always be the unwanted one." Yet there were other words, too, softer, slipping through cracks like light through shutters. She stood tall when he faced Hale. Maybe unwanted doesn't mean unworthy. Those murmurs carried her through the days, even as Hale's men loitered on corners, their laughter loud, their eyes lingering too long when she passed. The town square felt like a stage where she was forced to walk, every step measured under watchful eyes, the veil both shield and target. One night she dreamed it torn again, shredded in hands she could not see, but when she woke she found Elias beside her, his arm across her, his breath steady as if guarding her even in sleep. And in the silence, she realized the veil's weight had changed. It was no longer a mark of shame, but a challenge, daring her to prove she was more than the names they hurled. Yet the storm had not broken. Hale's pride had been cut before the church, and men like him did not lick their wounds in peace. As dawn broke the next morning, a rider carried word through Dustin. Vernon Hale had called for a gathering at his ranch, promising the town would see truth unmasked once and for all. She clutched the veil, her heart racing, knowing the hour of breaking would soon arrive, and wondering if Elias's vow could hold against the fury that loomed on the horizon. The day of Hale's gathering dawned sharp and clear, the air brittle with cold, the snow crunching hard beneath wagon wheels as townsfolk streamed toward his ranch. Word had spread like fire through dry grass. Hale meant to prove the Lakota warrior's choice a mockery, to tear down what little dignity the unwanted bride had gained. She rode beside Elias on the roan, the veil folded neatly in her lap, her fingers tight against it, every bounce of the saddle echoing the thrum of her heart. From every wagon they passed, eyes turned, some filled with pity, others sharp with hunger for spectacle. "He'll make a fool of her again," a man muttered as they passed, "and this time the warrior won't stop it." At Hale's spread, the yard swarmed with people, lanterns strung across the porch, though it was still daylight, the smell of spiced cider and roasting meat thick in the air. It might have looked a festival, but beneath the surface lay the crackle of malice. Hale stood on the steps, broad-shouldered, hat tipped back, his smile wide and false. "Welcome, Dustin," he called. "Today we'll see truth plain as day, whether a man's pride can make shame into honor, or whether cloth and silence hide nothing worth keeping." Laughter rose, brittle and sharp, and all eyes swung to her as she slid from the saddle, Elias steadying her with a hand. The crowd parted, forming a ring in the yard as Hale strode forward, his boots kicking up frost. He bowed mockingly, then held up a fresh length of white muslin. "A veil for the unwanted bride," he crowed. "Shall we see if hiding her face makes her fit to stand?" The crowd chuckled, eager, and her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. But before she could falter, Elias stepped into the circle, his shadow cutting across Hale's smirk. His voice rang deep, carrying to the edges of the crowd. "No veil makes her worthy. She is worthy because she endures, and because she chose." Murmurs rippled, some startled, some scoffing, but Hale only sneered, tossing the muslin at her feet. "Then prove it," he snarled. "Let them all see what you guard." Gasps rippled, the crowd leaning forward, waiting for her shame to be stripped again. For a heartbeat she could not move, her hands trembling, her knees weak. But Elias turned, his eyes on hers, steady as stone. "Stand," he whispered, not as command but as vow. "I am with you." She bent, not for the muslin but for her own torn veil, lifting it high. Her voice shook but carried clear enough for the ring to hear. "This veil was torn by scorn and trampled in dirt, yet it is still mine, and I will wear it as long as I choose, not because it hides me, but because it shows I endured." The crowd hushed, whispers breaking sharp. Hale's face darkened, fury twisting his mouth. "Pretty words," he spat, "but endurance won't hold when men take what they want." He reached as if to snatch the veil again, but Elias stepped between them, his hand gripping Hale's wrist like iron. The air crackled as gasps broke from the circle. Elias's voice dropped low, fierce enough to chill the blood. "Touch it again, and you won't draw breath to boast." Hale yanked back, his pride wounded, but his eyes gleamed with a promise of worse. The crowd, once eager for shame, now muttered uncertainly, the first cracks splintering in their laughter. Yet as Elias led her back through the ring, the veil pressed tight against her heart. She knew this was not the end. Hale would strike again, harder, and next time he would not come with words but with force. That night, the cabin walls could not hold the weight of what had passed at Hale's ranch. She sat at the table, the veil folded between her palms, her heart still hammering from the circle of jeers and the fire in Elias's eyes when he had caught Hale's wrist. Outside, the wind moaned through the cottonwoods, carrying faint echoes of voices from town, whispers that would not die. Elias stood at the window, his broad frame lit by the fire's glow, his braids falling loose over his shoulders as he scanned the darkness beyond the glass. "They will come again," he said quietly, the certainty in his voice sharper than any threat. She swallowed, her throat dry. "He won't forgive what you did, shaming him before them all." Elias turned, his gaze steady, his voice low. "Hale's pride is a wound. Wounded men strike hardest." She touched the frayed edge of the veil, the fabric rough where boots had crushed it, and felt tears prick her eyes. Every time they tear it, I feel myself torn with it. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her, his calloused hand covering hers, the veil caught between. "Cloth can be torn," he said, his voice like stone, "but not you. They mistake your silence for weakness. I see what they refuse to." She met his eyes, the weight of his words piercing through her fear. For a moment the veil no longer felt like shame, but like a banner, proof that she had stood through the storm. Yet the knock came sudden, harsh against the door. She startled, clutching the fabric tighter, while Elias rose, his rifle in hand. "Who?" he barked. Silence. Then a voice, slick with mockery. Colby Jett, Hale's youngest hand. "McGraw's unwanted bride," he called, laughter behind the words. "Hale says she belongs to the town now. Come see how quick she's stripped of her warrior's pride." Rage surged through her, shame and fury twined until her cheeks burned. Elias flung the door open. Rifle leveled, his silhouette filling the frame. 3 men sat astride their horses, torches in hand, grinning wide. Colby leaned forward, his teeth flashing. "You can't guard her forever, Redfeather. Men talk. Soon they'll take what you can't hold." Elias's voice thundered, steady as an oath. "Ride before I put your torch in the dirt with your blood." The men chuckled, mocking, but something in his eyes made them hesitate. Colby spat into the snow, then jerked his reins. "Hale will finish what you started," he sneered, "and next time, no veil will save her." They wheeled their horses, torches casting wild shadows as they vanished into the night. Elias closed the door, bolting it firm, then set the rifle against the wall. She rose, trembling but fierce, the veil still in her grip. "They will tear it again," she whispered, "and me with it." Elias stepped close, his voice soft now, fierce with promise. "Then let them come. When the veil falls, I will be there to lift it again, and again, until they learn it is not the cloth they fight, but us." She pressed the veil to her heart, the firelight flickering against the frayed threads, and for the first time she felt not like the unwanted bride, but like the chosen one, guarded by a man whose vow could not be broken. Yet in the silence that followed, she knew Hale's storm was gathering, and when it struck, it would not be with taunts, but with violence meant to shatter them both. The storm broke in the heart of Dustin. Word spread that Hale had called the men to the square, claiming the town's honor demanded the unwanted bride be stripped of her false crown. By midday, the streets swelled with onlookers, children perched on barrels, women clutching shawls, men gathered in tight knots, whispering of spectacle. She walked beside Elias, the veil pinned in her hair, her fingers trembling as they clutched his arm, each step louder in her ears than the roar of the crowd. When they reached the square, Hale stood atop the fountain's ledge, broad hat low, his voice booming. "Here she is," he cried, "the girl no man wanted. Paraded as if she were queen! Dustin, will we bow to this shame?" Cheers and laughter split the air, harsh and biting. Elias's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Hale leapt down, striding toward them, his eyes fixed on the veil. "Take it off," he snarled. "Let them see truth again." Gasps rippled, the crowd leaning forward, eager. She froze, heart pounding, her breath shallow. Hale's hand shot out, but Elias caught his wrist mid-strike, twisting hard until the man hissed in pain. The square fell silent, the sound of struggle echoing loud in the stillness. Elias's voice thundered. "No man tears from her what she guards. This veil is not yours to touch." Hale's face flushed scarlet, his pride burning hotter than the pain. He wrenched free, his voice breaking with rage. "She shames us all. If you won't strip the veil, then I will break you to prove it." He swung, fists like clubs, and the crowd roared. Elias met him blow for blow, the square erupting into chaos as men shouted wagers, women screamed, and children scrambled for sightlines. She pressed to the edge, veil clutched tight, her heart tearing with every strike. Hale was powerful, his fists landing hard, but Elias fought with a fury drawn not from pride, but from vow. Again and again he rose, his braids whipping, his eyes blazing until the crowd hushed, the weight of his defiance breaking through their bloodlust. At last Hale staggered, blood at his lip, his chest heaving. He lunged one final time, reaching for the veil pinned in her hair, but Elias caught him, driving him hard into the dirt. The square rang with the crack of his fall, the laughter dying to silence. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, voice raw but clear. "You call her unwanted. I call her mine, and I will stand until none of you dare speak her name with scorn again." He turned, his hand outstretched, and she stepped forward, placing her trembling fingers in his. The veil fluttered loose, half torn, dangling between them, and the crowd gasped as he lifted it gently, brushing the dust away. His voice softened but carried. "This veil does not hide her, it crowns her." A murmur spread, some scoffing, others stunned into awe. Hale groaned in the dirt, his pride shattered, his men too cowed to move. The silence grew heavy, and for the first time, she felt the tide shift. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Children stared not with cruelty, but with wide-eyed wonder. Women whispered with envy, men with grudging respect. She pressed the veil to her heart, her tears falling freely, and when Elias led her from the square, the sound that followed was not laughter, but the weight of silence breaking into something new. Yet as they left, she knew Hale's hatred had not died. It smoldered still, and before dawn he would strike again, desperate to reclaim what he had lost. That night the air lay heavy with the threat of unfinished vengeance, every creak of the cabin timbers loud as gunfire in the silence. She sat by the fire, the veil spread across her lap, its fabric torn in two places, the edges stained with dust and blood from the square. Her fingers worked stitches with trembling hands, trying to mend what had been ripped again and again, but no thread could fully erase the scars. Elias paced near the door, rifle in reach, his eyes fixed on the shadows crawling beyond the window. When at last he turned to her, his voice was low but steady. "Hale will come before dawn. He cannot bear the silence after his fall." She swallowed, the needle pausing, her heart twisting with dread. "If he tears it again, I don't know if I can stand." Elias crossed to her, kneeling, his broad frame folding down until his eyes were level with hers. His hand closed over the veil, halting her trembling fingers. "Then let him tear it. Each time he does, I will lift it higher. Each time they mock, I will call you mine. Shame only lives if we let them speak louder than truth." Tears blurred her vision, but warmth surged through her chest at his vow. Before she could answer, the sound came. Hoof beats in the night, torches glowing through the cottonwoods, men's voices carried sharp on the wind. Elias rose, rifle in hand, his shadow stretching across the walls. She clutched the veil, her pulse hammering as the riders drew up to the gate. Vernon Hale's voice thundered, ragged with fury. "Come out, warrior! Tonight Dustin takes back its pride!" The door shuddered under the weight of fists, but Elias flung it open, stepping into the yard with the rifle leveled. Torchlight lit his face, hard as stone, his braids gleaming like dark fire. "Pride," he called. "You lost it when you trampled truth beneath your boots." Hale snarled, lunging forward, But Elias fired into the air, the crack splitting the night, horses rearing, men shouting. Silence fell sharp in the echo. Hale spat, his voice breaking. "You can't keep her. She was unwanted before you came, and she'll be unwanted when you're gone." From the porch, she stepped forward, veil clutched in her hands, her knees trembling but her voice rising strong enough to carry. "You call me unwanted, but he walked past every bride for me. He lifted this veil from the dirt when you tried to grind me into it. You cannot make me less by tearing cloth. I am chosen, and I am his." She lifted the veil high, its scars catching the torchlight like silver threads, no longer a mark of shame but of defiance. The crowd hushed, the riders shifting uneasily. Hale's fury cracked, his roar faltering against the weight of her words. He charged, hand outstretched to snatch the veil one final time. But Elias struck first, his fist crashing hard, sending Hale sprawling into the snow. Torches sputtered as his men faltered, fear breaking their bravado. No one moved to help him. The warrior took the veil from her hands, raising it high before the crowd, his voice thunderous. "This veil is not torn. It is whole because she stands. And I stand with her." The silence deepened, broken only by the crackle of torches and Hale's groans in the dirt. One by one, the riders turned their horses, retreating into the dark, leaving their leader broken and beaten. Elias lowered the veil, placing it gently back into her hands, his touch reverent. She pressed it to her heart, tears streaming freely now, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of victory. As dawn crept over the horizon, the veil hung in the cabin window, tattered but proud, a banner not of concealment but of love that had faced the storm and endured. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If your veil was torn before a crowd, would you let it mark your shame, or lift it as your crown?